So you like the new masking tools so much in the new Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom that you wish they could port over from there into Photoshop as layers, right? I've gotten a lot of questions from people asking me if you can take the masks that you create in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom with the new masking tool, and if you could magically just make those layers appear in Photoshop. Well, the answer is no. But I'm also going to challenge you and say that you probably wouldn't want them there anyway. What I mean by that is the masking that's available in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom is extremely powerful, and I'm really grateful that we have it there now. But it's not nearly as powerful as Photoshop. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through all of the masking tools in Adobe Camera Raw, and I'm going to show you how you could make those in Photoshop. And I think by the end of this video, you're going to say, yeah, I really don't want those masks in Photoshop. I'm glad I can make my own in Photoshop anyway. The reason is there's so much more versatility in Photoshop. Before we begin, I gotta just tell you this. I like to compartmentalize my workflow. Raw stuff happens at the raw level, Photoshop stuff happens at the Photoshop level, and I very rarely cross those paths. Once I'm done at the raw level, I move on to the Photoshop level. That's one of the reasons why I really don't use smart objects in my raw workflow. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to press Control Shift and A, which is going to take me into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Using that because it's just so much easier to bounce back and forth between Adobe Camera Raw as a filter and Photoshop. The masks though versus Adobe Camera Raw the program and Adobe Camera Raw the filter are going to be pretty much the same, if not identical. So let's go into the masking tools and let's go down the list. We're going to start with Select Subject. We'll move on to Select Sky. Then we'll talk about Brush, Linear, Radial, Color Range, and Luminance Range Masks. We've got a lot of stuff to cover, so let's just dive in. So if I press Select Subject, this is typically something that I'm going to use mainly on portrait work and kind of portrait work only. Now it's leaving my last settings here, so it looks absolutely hideous. Let's go ahead and reset those and just take a look at our mask. So this is the mask that we receive when we press Select Subject in Adobe Camera Raw, and magically it's there and it's very easy, right? It's just so simple. You just press Select Subject and you've got it. There is an equivalent to this in Photoshop, but while I'm here, I'm going to show you the inverse of this. If you just press the X key on this, you're not going to get Select Subject, you're going to get Select Background. So that's a nice thing to know, that all you got to do is press X on that and you've got the inverse of your subject. So what I'm going to do here, before I actually jump out of here, I'm going to take a screenshot of this. So I use my print screen button to do this. I'm just going to take a screen grab of what our mask looks like here in Adobe Camera Raw to show you that we can get the same mask in Photoshop. Now, as far as editing is concerned, anything I do within this section here is only going to affect what is white, or when I overlay, what is in magenta. So what do I have access to here? Basically anything that is going to be in my basic settings, I have access to in my mask here for this individual under Select Subject. So that's where things are very different in Photoshop, is that you don't get the sliders to move things around, but you get adjustment layers to work with those masks. Let's go ahead and just open this up. I'm going to just press OK. All I wanted to show you here was what that mask looks like. So I can go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. And we'll see. We'll call this ACR mask. Okay, so what's the equivalent now of that Adobe Camera Raw mask at the Photoshop level? Well, let's click on our background layer here, and we're going to go to Select and then Subject. Now, hypothetically speaking, we should get the exact same mask if Photoshop is using the same technology for both of them. So the way we can figure this out, I'll just put a solid color overlay on top of here that is going to be in the color magenta. Okay, so now we can bounce back and forth. Here's the Adobe Camera Raw mask. Here's the Photoshop mask. Now, just without even doing any select and mask to fix this and make it better, let's zoom in and see what Photoshop grabbed. Photoshop actually was much better about grabbing some of these fly or stray hairs, whereas in Adobe Camera Raw, we get a little bit more of what's happening in the background. However, for a mask in Adobe Camera Raw for doing raw level editing, that's awesome. But if you're ever wondering, how do I get Select Subject in Photoshop? That's how you do it. It's just as simple, it's just as easy. You go to Select and Subject. Now there is another way to select subject, and that's with the object selection tool. What we can do here is we can click and then hover over. I have my object selection tool mixed in with my quick selection tool, my magic wand. I can grab that tool and just draw a rectangle around my subject here, and it'll do its best judgment and find the figure. Now let's see what happens here if we go and press our solid color overlay with the color magenta. Here's where things get interesting. What technology now is Adobe Camera Raw using? Is it using select subject or is it using object selection? Well, here's where we can figure that one out. So right here, this is our, let's see here, object select. This one right here is our select subject. If we turn them on and off, you can see here that select subject does a little bit better of a job of getting some of those individual stray hairs that are happening there. So we'll go ahead and turn that off, turn that on. See that? So our ACR mask is actually doing a little bit better than the object selection tool. So here's a really interesting thing where we discovered that select subject from our menu is very different from object selection. So if you want a better, more pristine selection for your subjects, you probably want to use select subject instead of the object selection tool. Now, with that being said, in the new object selection tool, we also have the ability of just hovering over our subject here and finding what it can make a mask for. So if I click on that, it hovers over in blue and it shows me what it can create that mask for. But again, it's just using the object selection technology. Let's move on. Let's do select sky. Now I chose this image for a very specific reason, not because it has a beautiful blue sky or anything, but because it is a difficult sky to select. Because what do we have here? All these little nooks and crannies and crevices of white that are mixed in between the trees. So let's do this. Let's open this up in Adobe Camera Raw. Control Shift and A will open us up in Adobe Camera Raw in my PC hotkey. So I'm going to go over to the mask and I'm going to go to select sky. It's going to do its little crazy little algorithm here and find the sky for me. Now I have my masks to show the overlay in the color magenta. I highly recommend you move that to magenta, increase the brightness, increase the opacity, because this is what's going to show you how you get such good detailed masks. Now once we do select sky, all we have in Adobe Camera Raw is the sky selection. And I will say that this is a pretty darn good sky selection if you ask me. But it's missing some of the little nooks and crannies that are happening over here. Now, as far as editing this image specifically with our sky, it's not really going to help us much to move these sliders because it's pure white. The test here was to see if we could get a selection for the difficult white pieces that are happening in the background there. But just like the select subject, if you click on the mask and press X, it's going to select the foreground or the opposite of the sky. We press X again and it selects the sky. Let me take a screenshot of this so that we can test this in Photoshop. So I'll press Control C to copy that, and then we'll just open this up in Photoshop. I'll just say cancel because I really didn't do anything here. Now let's go ahead and paste our image on here and I'll make it bigger so we can get an idea of what we are seeing for our sky selection here. So we'll call this ACR sky, okay? So now what tool am I gonna use to select the sky in Photoshop? Well, I could use any of the selection tools like the quick selection tool if I wanted to click and drag around, but that would be very time consuming. One might be inclined to go to edit and then sky replacement just to get the mask for what that sky is gonna be. But the better way to do this is actually to go to select and then we're gonna go to sky. With this sky, it would be easy to do a select color range and just select that white as well, because that would help us get the sky. But let's use the select sky feature to see how it compares to Adobe Camera Raw sky feature. Now to test this, I'm going to go ahead and put a solid color fill on, change it to the color magenta, and now I'll turn on the ACR sky. So the Adobe Camera Raw sky versus the sky selection in Photoshop. Let's zoom in here and see what the ACR sky did. Okay, so it's not bad. It probably is pretty close to the same thing, okay? But there's a big difference here. If I just use select sky by itself, it doesn't really grab all of those little intricate little pockets of white that are happening behind the trees. There's a way that we can modify that though, which you can't really do as easily in Adobe Camera Raw. So let's go ahead and go to select sky again. Once we select this sky, there's a button up here that says select and mask. Go ahead and click that button. Now, once we get into select and mask, there is a tool here called the Refine tool, Refine Edge Brush tool. So we'll click on that. Make sure that we're set to color aware and not object aware. And then we're going to right click and make sure that our brush hardness is very low and is rather large. Okay, so right about there. Now, Photoshop is pretty smart in that if we leave this plus sign in the area that we want to sample for it to refine, it will, in a way, remember that. So if I'm in this white area and I click and I move out here and then I kind of unclick a little bit, you see how it kind of adapts to the image and it picks up those white pocketed areas. Okay, I'll do that again over here. Okay, and I'll just briefly do that over here as well. So that is now our new sky selection. Once I press OK, we now have a selection for our sky that is going to be much better. Okay, so we change that to our magenta, and it's a much better sky selection. Might still need some fine tuning and some working if I'm going to actually use this legitimately in my editing process. But the case that we're going on here is, can I import this Adobe Camera Raw sky over to Photoshop? The answer is no. And then the secondary question to that is, why would you want to when you have much more power in Photoshop anyway? I don't want to discredit the new Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom masking because it's extremely powerful. But at the same time, we have to be realists here and understand that there is much better ways to make masks in Photoshop than there is in Adobe Camera Raw. Remember, raw level workflow, good for quick, easy masks. Photoshop level workflow, intricate precision masking. Okay, so let me go ahead and delete this. Now we're going to move on to our next tool. So let's hop over to this image. And we'll just go ahead and delete some of the stuff that we did here because we don't need it anymore. And let's hop into Adobe Camera Raw, Control-Shift-A. The next tool I want to show you in the masking section is the brush tool. So if we go to our masks and we go to the brush, this is actually very similar to making a mask in Photoshop with a brush if you don't have auto mask selected. If you don't have auto mask selected and you brush on, it is simply a painted brush in Photoshop. That's all it is, okay? If you have auto mask on, it is pretty smart in that it stays within the area that it might think you want to make a mask for, okay? So it's pretty good. It's gonna adapt to it. It's not the worst, okay? It is overspraying a little bit and grabbing a little bit of the stuff on the outside, and that's okay. But how do we do this auto masking feature in Photoshop? Well, we can't do it with a brush, but we can do it with another tool. So let's go ahead and make a copy of this just so that we have it as a reference. Control C. It was just a very quick mask that I made here with the brush. We'll press OK. So now, Control V. Let's first talk about the type of mask that you would create on this image where you'd want to edit something. Now, we're going to have to go into a tool first for this. So I'm going to use an adjustment layer like, let's say, curves. Okay. And I'm just going to bring this down and make it darker. So if you only wanted that to affect a certain area like you would in Adobe Camera Raw, you would Control I and invert that mask. And then you would brush with the brush tool. And we're going to select a soft round brush. This is basically going to be, and we brush with white, it's going to make an area come back. It's essentially the same thing as what we're doing here in Adobe Camera Raw to brush this area and make that be the affected area. So how do we get the auto mask then? The auto mask is a really nice feature in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. How do we get an auto mask in Photoshop? Well, you don't do it with the brush. I'm going to click on this image. I'm going to click on our quick selection tool, which I feel is one of the best tools for this. And then if I brush on her, if my brush remains small, it's going to make a selection for her. The bigger my brush gets, the bigger the selection gets, and it might start going outside and spraying outside a little bit like you see over her shoulder there. So the smaller the brush, the better the selection we get for this auto masking. And if we overspray too much, just Alt or Option while you're on there, and you can carve away the area that you oversprayed, okay? And that's a little bit easier. You can do that in Adobe Camera Raw as well to get rid of some of the overspray as well. I just find it easier to do it in Photoshop, okay? And in Photoshop, I think it's a little bit smarter of a mask with that auto mask tool. So now that we have a selection for, let's make a curves adjustment layer just like we did on the other one. And this is now our mask for her. Now, if we look at the selection that we have here in Adobe Camera Raw, it could need some refining in order for that to work. It can still work. It would just need a lot of refinement, a lot of brush work to just select her with that auto brush or auto masking style feature. So for me, I still find that Photoshop is much more powerful here because once we have that selection, we can still, let's turn these layers off, go into select and mask, and we can refine the selection further. typically with our radius slider here and a smart radius, and then possibly refining that edge a little bit as well. If we go on the outside here, it may do a much better job. If we get too much of her face in there, Alt or Option to subtract it. And you see that this is very similar to the brush that we have for auto masking once we combine that with the select and mask feature. I will say this, Photoshop masks do require knowledge of more tools in order to make them work. In Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, it's very simple to just grab your brush and select. What we had to do to mimic that here in Photoshop to make that intricate mask is we had to grab our quick selection tool and then also refine that mask with select and mask, which some people can be intimidated by. So is it easier to do the masking at Adobe Camera Raw? Yes. Is it as accurate? I don't think so. Let's hop over to this image and we'll work on the next one. Control Shift and A to get into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Now, how would we do the linear gradient? Well, the linear gradient is very simple here in that once you click and start to drag, that becomes the area that's going to be affected by my image. Let's not combine this with anything else. Let's just say that for this, we want to make this a little bit darker in the foreground area there by lifting up our gradient here. And we can modify that gradient by making it press on a little bit further like this, and that will help control the spread that we have for this gradient. Now let's just go ahead and do a print screen of this so I can open this up in Photoshop and show you how to do it similarly in Photoshop. So in Photoshop, how we would do that same thing is by using this tool here, which is our gradient tool. Now we wouldn't just use our gradient tool and do this because it's just going to make our image black. Much like with anything in the past that we've shown here, you need to have some type of tool on here to make this mask applicable. So let's go Control V and see this mask, Control T, and then we'll do this. Okay. So now how would we get this mask in Photoshop? Let's go ahead and make a solid color fill. And with this solid color fill, we're going to set it to that magenta color and lift it all the way up. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on this mask and press Control I. Now in order for me to replicate this, I'm going to press Command or Control I on this mask. Now, to get that color fill to come back, I'm going to use the gradient tool set to a white to transparency. So we need to make sure that in our gradient editor, we are set to white to transparency. And then if I click from the bottom of my image and move up, we are going to get a very similar, if not the same, type of mask for our foreground element there. Now, how would this work with something like where we want to darken that area up just like that? Well, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and make a curves adjustment layer. And with that curves adjustment layer, I'm going to make it a little bit darker. Okay. Just like what we did by dropping the exposure and making it a little bit darker in the other one. And then I can just steal this mask. I'll press Alt or Option and then move this up and it'll ask me, do I want to replace it? Yep. And then now we have that darker in the foreground using a linear mask. Again, it's quite a bit more work. I know, because we have to understand masking here, but we can still get that linear mask from Adobe Camera Raw at the Photoshop level. Now let's see about the radial mask. Control Shift A to get us into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Now, if I go over to the masking section here, I'm going to go to the radial gradient. And with the radial gradient, let's go ahead and zero out all of our settings here. I'm just going to click right here from the middle and just go up like that. So it's more of her, okay? And then what I'm going to do here is just make the exposure just a little bit brighter so we can brighten her up just like that, okay? The radial gradient is very simple. I pressed and held Shift while I moved this circle to maintain the ratio, so it was a circle. But if you don't press and hold Shift, it's going to make an oval. Press and hold Shift, it's going to make a circle. Okay, so we've got that on there. Let's turn Show Overlay off to see what happens as we brighten this up. You see, we draw more attention to her by brightening her up with the radial filter, very similar to a spotlight. Okay, now let's go ahead and turn that Show Overlay back on because it's really not about the editing that we're doing here. It's about replicating the mask. I'm going to go ahead and make a print screen of this so that we can see that. So how do we get that type of a mask on our image? Again, this is going to require us to create an adjustment layer that would mimic the same effect because we can't just brush on here or use a radial tool to do this. I'm going to go ahead and put a curves adjustment layer on here and brighten her up. Okay. Now, in order to get the inverse effect here, so that we only allow this to happen where we want it to, let's press Control I on that mask to make it black. And then to make a radial mask, I'm just going to make my brush really big and use a soft round brush, really big, just like this. and brush with white where I want that curve to come back. And there you go. It's essentially the same thing as what we saw with our Adobe Camera Raw radial filter. We don't have the radial control over it. What controls the radial is going to be the size of our brush. Now let's go ahead and talk about the luminance and color range masks. So let me delete these, Control-Shift-A. So let's talk about our color range. Control-Shift and A to get me into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. Go to Masks, go to Color Range. The principle behind color range is that we have an eyedropper that we need to select a color for. So I'm going to select a color for this green right here. Now the refine here is how much of that green is being selected, how far it spreads out into the neighboring colors that are similar to this color green. So let's just leave it here like this. I'll do a print screen. Okay. If we were to choose a different color, I'll do that in a second. We could choose a different color from this by just using our sampling tool that we have here and select this area, which is going to be more of our reds and oranges. Okay. So let's just stick with the green for now, but the principle behind this is just what color do you want to select and how do you want to modify it? We select this color green. We can then refine that green and get more of its neighboring color of green. How do we get that now in Photoshop? Well, in Photoshop, we actually have a tool that is in our select area. So we go to select, we actually have a color range tool. Now, when we go there, we have many ways that we can sample our colors, which is actually much better in my personal opinion than what you have in Adobe Camera Raw. You have to use a sampling for a color in Adobe Camera Raw. You can't go and choose your reds, your yellows, your greens, your cyans, your blues, your magentas. You can't do that. You're stuck with, when you hit that eyedropper, that's the color that you get. With this, we can do our sampled color and we'll select that color green. And instead of refine, the word in Photoshop is fuzziness. We move the fuzziness up. It's going to make a bigger, broader selection for that color green. We press OK. Let's see if it's similar to the color that we're going to get from Adobe Camera Raw. It's probably going to be close, and it is pretty darn close. Actually, the spread that you see here, if we zoom in here, is much better in Photoshop than it is in Adobe Camera Raw. It's a smoother, finer selection, whereas this is a very rough, hard edge selection. So when it comes to the color ranges and the luminance ranges, you are much better off in Photoshop. Much better off in Photoshop. But it's nice to have them in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom as well. Now the luminance range we're going to do in a slightly different way than most probably would. So let's go ahead and press Control-Shift and A to get into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. We're going to hop on over into our mask. We're going to go to luminance range. Now the luminance range here is very similar, if not the same, as blend if. Okay, so that's how I'm going to already give you the secret. The best way to make a luminance range mask in Photoshop is with blend if. So what we can do here is we can either adjust this so that we can see what our mask is going to be, or we can make a physical selection on our image with the eyedropper. When we click on this highlight area back here, it is making a physical selection of what it is deeming that tonal range to be. Very similar to color range, but it's going to actually be using the tonal values. Or we can dial in our tonal values by using the slider here. By making our spread larger, we make our selection for the tonal range that we want larger, and then the spread of the mask larger here. I actually prefer to do this in Photoshop using blend if, but again, it's nice to have this at the raw level. So we're going to make this a selection for our highlights. Let's do our print screen here, and let's see if we can make a luminance range selection for our highlights in Photoshop. We'll press OK. I'm going to go ahead and revert our settings here. We don't need that. Control V, Control T. I'll make this larger. This is just our reference image so that we know what our luminance range looked like in Adobe Camera Raw. So in order to do this, I'm going to use a solid color fill. That solid color fill I'm going to use is magenta. Okay, just experimenting here. And in order to make our range selection, our luminance range selection for the highlights, you could use select color range. You could use luminosity masks, but I'm telling you, blend if is the easiest way to do it. So what we do to get into blend if is we just double click anywhere outside of where the text is, double click here, and that's going to take us into our layer styles dialog. Now, in order to make a selection for our highlights, it's very similar. But what we'll have to say to ourselves is we need to protect the underlying layers, shadow areas from receiving this effect. And in turn, that will select our highlights. So you see here, this is our frame of reference for making our highlight selection. Very similar to what we saw in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom. Now, how do we get that feather? Because you can't do that with Blend If by just moving this slider. Well, to get that feather, okay, we go over here because that's about where we were in Adobe Camera Raw. Alt or Option click, and you can feather this out to make a better selection for those highlights. And that's a pretty good selection, okay? Now let's look at the difference between the two. Here's the one from Adobe Camera Raw. Here's the one in Photoshop. What I really want you to pay attention to here is just how well the luminance is handled in Photoshop when it's using the RGB values of 0 to 255. The big difference here is that we have 0 to 255, so when we make our spread, we have a much better spread. But my assumption is that in Adobe Camera Raw, it's using the luminance channel, or the L channel from your LAB, which only is 0 to 100. In that case, the selections are going to be much more chunky. Okay, look at the difference here. They don't resonate or spread out very well as it does with Blend If. So you have a much better selection method with Blend If for your luminance range than you do with Adobe Camera Raw. Now, I know that this was a much longer video than you expected it to be, but I've received so many questions about this topic, probably at least 3 to 5 emails a day, asking me one of two things. One, do we still need to do masking in Photoshop? Well, we've proved that point. Absolutely. Because no matter what masking you're using in Adobe Camera Raw, the masks in Photoshop are going to be far superior. And it's designed that way. It's been handling masking for, 20 some years, right? Whereas in Adobe Camera Raw, this is relatively new technology. The masks aren't quite as well and there as they are in Photoshop. The second question I get asked a lot is, I've done all this masking in Adobe Camera Raw. Why can't I port this over into Photoshop? Well, the two don't speak to each other. You see, they use similar technology in order to make the masks, but what happens at the raw level stays at the raw level. It doesn't transition over into Photoshop, and rightfully so. Because after seeing this, I think that you can agree with me that the masks that we receive in Photoshop are far superior. Of all the masks in Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, I think the best one by far is the Luminance one. If you want to learn more about that, I have a video right here for you. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. I do sincerely appreciate it. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing. I take very difficult things in Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw and make them seem very simple so that you can use them in your workflow today.